Chapter 7. A Jaunt Around Town. They would take a carriage from Jinchi's rooms to the gate of the outer court. Mao Mao's dramatic and successful transformation of her master was a double-edged sword. A man who looked like Jinchi now did bumbling around the palace was going to attract suspicion. Even the lowliest of maids and manservants were supplied with halfway decent clothing here. It might have seemed obvious to simply put on more refined clothing for the journey out, but considering Jinchi's stomach was artificially stuffed, a change of clothes later would have been tricky. This was a source of irritation to Mao Mao, who wanted everything to be perfect and was rather incensed at Jinchi's failure to understand his own beauty. They disembarked the carriage in a quiet spot, and almost immediately, Mao Mao began lobbing critiques at Jinchi. "Master Jinchi, your posture is much too good. Slouch a little." At the moment, Jinchi stood as straight as if there were a string attaching his head to the heavens. "Well, speak for yourself," he grumbled. "A little heavy on the formalities, aren't we? And don't use my name, it defeats the point." His tone was rough, just like the man he now ostensibly was. Mao Mao privately admitted that he was right, but in that case, what should she call him? She narrowed her eyes and stared closely at Jinchi. Though she hadn't meant to, it made her look as though she were studying a moth that had fluttered up to a lantern. Jinchi's expression shifted to something difficult to describe. "What shall I call you then, sir?" Mao Mao finally asked. "Good question," Jinchi said, stroking his chin. He hummed for a moment, then said, "Call me Jinka." Jinka, Mao Mao thought. It wasn't particularly odd, and she was happy to use it, but the deliberate choice of the character ka, which meant flower, was somewhat surprising in a man's name. But then again, Jinchi wasn't the most masculine name in the world either. Mao Mao briefly regretted that she hadn't simply disguised Jinchi as a woman, but then she remembered that a dab of rouge and thought better of it. She shook her head. Jinchi must never appear in woman's clothing, lest the very world tear itself apart. "Very well then, Master Jinka," Mao Mao started, but she caught Jinchi glaring at her. "Ah, yes, the formality." "Jinka, then. No honorifics, no deference." Mao Mao found the ornate mode of polite speech employed at the palace tricky to navigate, but in her mind, completely casual language was even harder. And what was that gleam in Jinchi's eyes? She'd worked so hard to make him appear sickly. He would bring the illusion crashing down if he looked too pleased. "Excellent, milady," he said, his tone somewhat facetious. "Huh?" Mao Mao gaped at him, and Jinchi grinned broadly. "I should think this manner of speech is most suited, considering our respective appearances," he said, looking Mao Mao up and down. Mao Mao's own disguise had been arranged by Suiren, who had dressed her in hand-me-downs from her own daughter. There was a whiff of camphor about them, but the make and material were excellent and the design thoughtful, so they didn't look out of vogue. Her hair had been carefully gathered up and secured with a hair stick. She did indeed present the image of an affluent young lady. Now Mao Mao pursed her lips and trotted off. "Let's get this over with." "Yes, ma'am." Mao Mao was profoundly uncomfortable with this reversal of their accustomed roles, but Jinchi looked like he was having the time of his life. Jinchi's destination was a restaurant just outside the pleasure district. Apparently, he had a meeting with some sort of acquaintance there, but Mao Mao didn't press for details. Not asking too many questions, she felt, was frequently a wise way to get by in the world. Still, she couldn't help feeling somewhat used by Jinchi and Gaoxuan. "Maybe I should act a little more oblivious," she thought as she walked down the street. The road was home to a market bustling with merchants hawking their wares. Leafy green vegetables were still few and far between at this time of year, but there were plenty of fat daikon. Mao Mao had been given a bit of pocket change. She was just thinking that maybe she would have someone wring a chicken's neck for her and boil it with some daikon, when someone grabbed her by the collar. "What is it?" she asked. Jinchi was looking down at her with a most distressing grin on his face. "You're going to go shopping?" he asked. "I saw something I want. I was just going to go get it." "Looking like that?" She took his point. A woman who was well off enough to have an attendant with her would never dirty her hands purchasing her own produce, let alone having a chicken slaughtered. Mao Mao gazed longingly at the vegetables. "But I wanted to make it for my old man," she thought. Pops was both a doctor and an apothecary par excellence, but he had one glaring flaw. A total inability to weigh profit and loss. Thus, though apothecary's work should have kept him eating luxury foods for the rest of his life, he instead lived in a shack that looked like it could fall down in a stiff breeze. Of course, if he ever seemed like he was really going to starve for want of food, the old madam would probably have funneled it into him. Mao Mao resumed walking, pouting now. Jinchi was still trying to pretend to be her manservant, but he had a long stride, and before she knew it, he was in front of her. Mao Mao had to pick up her pace to keep up with him. She thought. He's got a long way to go. Jinchi's eyes were still sparkling. He at least managed not to gawk, but he was obviously enjoying where he was and what he was doing. To a pampered aristocrat like him, a common market must have been a novel sight. Mao Mao overtook Jinshi and glared at him. He seemed to realize he'd been careless and looked chastened for a moment, but then he set off walking again as if nothing had happened. At least he stayed behind Mao Mao this time. Mao Mao said nothing out loud, but she thought to herself, "When I get home, I've got to see how the field is doing." She crooked her fingers, counting as she imagined what herbs she might find there. "I wonder if the mugwort has come in yet, and how terrific would it be if the butterbur were ready to pick?" She still said nothing out loud. She was just imagining herself frying the butterbur with some meat and miso when she realized Jinshi was looming just beside her. "What is it, sir?" Mao Mao said, glaring at Jinshi and inadvertently reverting to her usual deference. Jinshi was clearly itching to say something. "Why so quiet?" he asked, likewise adopting the directness to which he was usually entitled. Why wasn't she saying anything? Well, there could really be just one reason, couldn't there? "Because I don't have anything to say?" She had only spoken the truth, but apparently that was a mistake. Jinshi bit his lip, an inscrutable expression crossed his face. Mao Mao wasn't worried that he might burst into tears. He wasn't a little boy, but he still managed to look thoroughly pathetic. "He was the one who said I should act more brisk with him," Mao Mao thought. She wasn't normally the type to initiate a conversation anyway, so when she didn't have anything in particular to talk about, and when no one was asking her any specific questions, she tended to keep her peace. Why this was such a shock to this man mystified her. She was just scratching the back of her neck nervously, wondering what to do, when a meat skewer's stall came into view. She broke into a brisk trot and ordered 2 skewers from the man behind the counter. Just looking at the perfectly crisp chicken meat made her mouth water. "Try it," she said, passing one of the skewers to Jinshi. He slowly took it, looking at it as if he'd never seen one before. "Quick, before it gets cold." Mao Mao guided them to a small side street just off the main road. She brushed some dust off a wooden crate and sat down on top of it. When she bit into the grilled meat, the juices exploded in her mouth, and the fragrant chicken skin gave an audible snap. "God, that's good." Mao Mao leaned forward to keep the juices from running onto her clothes. Jinshi wasn't eating, but just watched her. "Not going to have yours? As you can see, it isn't poisoned." "No, that's, not what I'm worried about," Jinshi said, tapping his cheek. "Ah." Now she remembered. She had stuffed cotton into his mouth to help give him a different profile. Mao Mao took out a square of paper and passed it to him. He spat out the cotton balls and tossed them into a nearby wastebasket. A versatile paper square like that one was very valuable, just another of Suiren's thoughtful touches, along with the clothes. "I didn't think to bring any replacement cotton," Mao Mao thought. This rubbed her perfectionist streak the wrong way, but she doubted it was something most people would actually notice. Still inspecting the skewer with a certain amount of wonder, Jinshi brought it to his mouth. It must have been a little warm for him, because he blew on it forcefully before chewing and swallowing. "What do you think, sir?" "Damn sight better than what they served at the bivouac. Good and salty," Jinshi said, wiping the juice off his lips with his fingers. Mao Mao took a handkerchief out of her pouch and handed it to him, but she was thinking, bivouac? Eunuchs, as far as she knew, didn't normally serve in the military, so she wasn't sure what to make of this. Maybe a person like Jinshi would be roughing it out in the wilderness if a war started or something, but under normal circumstances, what would lead a eunuch spending his nights in the field? As she entertained the question, Mao Mao stuffed Jinshi's face. A bit of the makeup had come off around his mouth, but it wasn't enough to worry about. She looked away. "All right, whatever our business is here, let's get it over with," she thought. She finished the last of the meat on her skewer and stood up from the crate. She was determined to go back and buy that daikon and chicken once she ditched Jinshi. Despite her hassle, Jinshi insisted on doing everything with slow, elegant movements, much to Mao Mao's annoyance. "Are you quite sure you're going to be in time for your meeting, Jinka?" she asked pointedly, using his fake name. "I think we've got a few minutes yet." "Wouldn't it be best to arrive early? It's bad manners to make someone wait for you." Now it was Jinshi who looked annoyed. "If I didn't know better, I'd think you were trying to get rid of me." "Would you?" Mao Mao said innocently. But of course, Jinshi had hit the nail on the head. He looked a bit sullen, but didn't complain further. Instead, he changed the subject. "I can't imagine life in the palace is that bad. Surely it must be better than here in the pleasure district." Mao Mao had to admit, it wasn't terrible, particularly now that she was serving there of her own volition. She had a small but clean room, and an offer to move to other quarters. She had been quite lucky, she felt. But the lifestyle wasn't the only reason she might have to want to go back to the pleasure district. "I'm worried whether my old man is taking proper care of himself," she said. Jinshi's mouth practically hung open. "What?" Mao Mao asked. It's nothing. Never knew you were interested in anything besides drugs and poisons. Mau Mau replied with a glare. Rude bastard. My adoptive father is my teacher in matters of medicine, so I certainly hope he'll continue to live a good long time. Then she turned her back decisively on Jinchi and started walking. Yes, she knew for sure now. She wanted to get this over with. Jinchi, looking slightly frazzled, came up alongside her. This father of yours, I gather he's indeed a talented apothecary? After a moment, Mau Mau answered hesitantly, He is. She didn't think it was fair of Jinchi, leveraging talk of her father like this. Apparently he studied in the West when he was a young man. Thus he was familiar not only with her own region's traditional medicine, but with Western medical techniques as well. She occasionally saw him taking notes in a foreign language, and once in a while he would use words that sounded quite unusual to her. It made her think he must have been quite some time in that foreign land. Really? He did that? Jinchi asked. He must have been something special then. I believe people are only sent on those studies by endorsement from the government. His transparent amazement only confirmed for Mau Mau that her father was an exceptional person. Yes, he is rather incredible. The old proverb holds that heaven doesn't give two gifts to one man, but I guess there are exceptions to the rule. The excitement was creeping into her voice now, and she was growing more voluble than usual. He must have been quite a man indeed. Jinchi, in contrast, looked more subdued than before. Perhaps she'd said too much, and something in her flood of words had upset him. He was the one who insisted I talk, she thought. She wished he would make up his blasted mind. Jinchi, desperate to look at anything but Mau Mau, let his gaze wander among the shops that lined the street. The restaurants and food stalls had given way to places selling textiles and accessories. Men flitted from one to the next, picking presents to please their nighttime butterflies. And what is such a distinguished person doing running a druggist shop in a nameless corner of the pleasure district? There was a thorn hidden in Jinchi's words. Heaven gave him many gifts, but luck was not one of them. And as much as he was given, something was also taken from him. Something important. Ill fortune. That was Loman's one great flaw, if he had one. His study in the West had proven sufficient pretext for the former emperor's mother, that is to say, the former empress dowager, to have him made a eunuch. Jinchi watched Mau Mau silently. Just as she was starting to fear that another of her red light district jokes had fallen flat, he said, You're telling me that the father who adopted you is a eunuch? Yes, sir, Mau Mau said, wondering if she hadn't mentioned it before. Jinchi started mumbling. Eunuch, apothecary, doctor. Amidst this talking and mumbling, they reached their destination. Mau Mau looked at the note Gauchwin had given her. I believe that's it, sir, she said, pointing to a place just at the border of the pleasure district. The upper floor was an inn and the lower a restaurant, a fairly standard arrangement. Yes, I think you're right. But we still have a few minutes, Jinchi said, looking around. Ah, now I get it, Mau Mau thought, narrowing her eyes too. She understood why Jinchi had gone to all the trouble of disguising himself and marching around the town market. Yes, she saw it all now. Mau Mau let out a long breath. I fear that traipsing around too much will cause your makeup to come off. Besides, the person you're meeting might be inside already. Better to go have a look than to risk making them wait, isn't it? Jinchi finally seemed to take the hint. I shall part ways with you here then, sir. What? Here? Yes, you took the trouble of disguising yourself. It would spoil everything if I walked in with you. Mau Mau gave a polite nod of the head and started back toward the market. As she went, she glanced over her shoulder to see Jinchi entering the restaurant. I guess even eunuchs need a day off now and then, she thought. She crossed her arms and nodded. And then she started thinking again. If he was going to come all the way out here, he might as well just go into the pleasure district proper. For she knew what kind of restaurant it was that Jinchi had just gone into. They served the waitresses, along with the food. Well, I hope he has a good night, she thought a touch caustically, staring at the restaurant with a freezing look in her eye.